Welcome. The following presentation was recorded at the annual Best Practices for Pollinators Summit hosted by Pollinator Friendly Alliance and the Xerces Society. Please consider participating in the annual summit next year. You can find more about the summit at pollinatorfriendly.org/summit.
Jump right in then. Well, hi everyone. Thanks to all of you for making the time for this today, and thanks to Lori for organizing this conference. It's really great to speak to so many people committed to making change and protecting pollinators. I'm really excited to talk to you today about pesticide reduction and ecological IPM strategies for communities and parks. I'm a pesticide program specialist with the Xerces Society, and I've been with Xerces for about a year. And prior to this, I did a lot of pollinator and natural enemy conservation work in urban areas, as well as biological control research. And I also want to thank my colleague, Sharon Salvaggio, for being here today to help answer questions at the end. Sharon has a wealth of experience doing IPM work, and her knowledge is really amazing. So I wanted to give you a quick outline of where we're going with this talk. We want to first touch on why ecological integrated pest management, and then talk about principles and methods of ecological IPM, and some examples kind of drilling into some of these concepts. And then talk about briefly the outcomes of adopting an ecologically based IPM approach, and then touch on a few slides at the end about community level change. And I want to first acknowledge and thank all of these Xerces Society supporters. Without them, we could not do the work that we do, and their support is really so important. And on that note, I want to add that we are a donor-supported nonprofit. So if you aren't already a member and you're able, I encourage you to donate and become a member today. You'll be joining an extraordinary group of people who've shown themselves to be inquisitive and engaged and who really care about protecting invertebrates. So I know there have been a lot of Xerces speakers over the past 2 days, but if you're just tuning in and if you haven't heard of the Xerces Society, we've been around since 1971, working to protect wildlife through the conservation of invertebrates and their habitats. Our name is a reference to the Xerces blue butterfly, which is believed to be the first American butterfly to go extinct due to human development, and it lived in the coastal sand dunes around San Francisco. And we do a variety of on-the-ground conservation work, with programs focusing on pollinators and agricultural biodiversity, endangered species, pesticides, and we do community engagement work in residential communities as well. We really kind of work in all sorts of areas. So here's some snapshots on this slide of kind of what those landscapes look like. But perhaps the most helpful work we do is writing detailed science-based guides for protecting pollinators and other invertebrates. And you can visit our website for free national as well as regional resources on plants, pollinators, other invertebrates, like mussels. And this library is really decades of work, and it has fantastic information. So I encourage all of you to check it out at xerces.org. There's materials related to what we're talking about today, as well as pollinator habitat plant selection, endangered species, just so much information. Okay, so let's dive in now to the talk. So this first part might be review for some of you, but I want to make sure we're all on the same page before we dive in with some examples. So why consider ecologically based IPM? You might wonder if there's really a need to put an ecological perspective into pest management, when many of our parks look like this a lot of the time, grass, trees, buildings, people. And you might ask, what do places for people, built spaces, have to do with ecology anyway? And does ecology even include people? So I'll try to answer those questions. So first, why ecological IPM? There are a lot of reasons, but since this summit is about pollinators, let's focus on pollinators. It's been the focus of all the great talks we've been hearing over the past few days. As you all likely know, scientists are documenting a large-scale loss of pollinator diversity, with estimates that 40% of native pollinator species across the country are showing signs of stress and decline. And one way this shows up is range contractions. So species that used to inhabit a certain geographic area are now gone from that region. And another way is just simply declines in abundance. So a species that used to be common is now rare. And this is obviously concerning, since pollinators help us grow food, And then, of course, allow for fertilization and reproduction of native plants that are essential to our ecosystems. So what's causing these declines? There are several major drivers that scientists agree on, but a couple are directly related to ecological IPM. So one is habitat loss. It's a major factor largely due to agricultural expansion and urbanization. And then what we're focusing on today, pesticides. 1 billion pounds of pesticides are used each year in the US, and this use is a major cause of pollinator declines. Bee kills from pesticides have been widely reported, but even when they don't kill pollinators, most pesticides can also cause subtle negative effects that slowly result in population decline. And any pesticide use, even in towns and cities, really can have far-ranging unintended consequences. Another reason to consider ecologically based pest management is that 98% of insects aren't pests. So this might catch you by surprise given how much attention pest species get, but only an estimated 2% of all insects cause economic damages or health damages to people. The others are vital as food for other species, they recycle nutrients, they do pest control in gardens and farms, and then of course pollination. So going back to that earlier question, does ecology include people? The answer is yes, because we rely on insects to do all of those things, although we often don't even think about it. Again, I mentioned them, pollination, pest control, nutrient cycling, they're really essential. And a quick note, you're going to hear me use the word pest a lot in this presentation. Please keep in mind that I'm thinking of not just insect pests, but also of diseases and weeds. And similarly, when I'm discussing pesticides, I'm referring not just to insecticides, but also fungicides and herbicides. I also want to emphasize that the idea of a pest is really a human construct. It represents something that humans don't want in our spaces. But outside of areas where there's potential conflict with humans, the species might not be a problem at all. So an example is mice in the woods. They're fine there, but in our buildings, we don't tend to like having mice. Let's see, moving on here. Another reason to be focused on ecologically based pest management is that urban areas, including urban parks and residential areas, hold more potential for bee conservation than previously thought. Studies have found some cities to have surprisingly diverse and relatively intact pollinator communities, and sometimes cities can even have a higher bee diversity than the surrounding landscape, particularly when that landscape is heavily agricultural. So residential areas can function as high quality habitat and refuge for insects and other animals like birds, which is something that's really exciting to me. And this is the case even at the single site level, just like one yard or a park. But together, numerous sites can scale up and provide more connected and functional habitat across the landscape. But these areas need to be managed properly, and that includes protection from pesticides. So as I mentioned, pesticide use in cities and towns can have far-ranging unintended consequences. For example, the largest mass bumblebee kill from pesticides ever recorded occurred in 2013, when 50,000 bumblebees were poisoned in a shopping center parking lot in Wilsonville, Oregon. There's some photos of this on this slide here. The application that killed them was made to parking lot trees, and the application was aimed at killing aphids that were dripping honeydew on cars in the parking lot. So of course the applicators didn't mean to kill all these bees, but it's a good example of recognizing that when we apply a pesticide, there can be very large unintended consequences. And I also think this is a stark reminder that it doesn't matter how high quality the habitat is that we create in cities and towns if pollinators aren't protected from pesticide applications like this one. So I hope that also helps answer the question of, do we even need to think about ecology if it's in a highly developed park, or in this case, a parking lot? And the answer is yes. There's so much more living in these spaces and using them as habitat than we might realize. So the alternative is ecologically based integrated pest management. So now let's dive in and talk about what this means and some of the principles and methods behind this concept. And some of you may be familiar with ecological IPM already, and this will be review, but some of you may not be, especially since different organizations and even industries use the term IPM a little bit different. So there are lots of different definitions or ways to describe IPM. So here are three good ones. I'll take a few seconds of silence so that you can read these definitions. And if you see common concepts, please feel free to put your observations into the Q&A chat. Here at Xerces, we focus on long-term suppression of pests by eliminating their underlying causes. And by doing this, we can achieve the goals of safety and lowered impacts to pollinators and to people. Okay, so let's boil IPM down. There are three principles, or as we like to imagine, legs of a stool that can be used to help you solve pest problems while minimizing pesticide reliance. So the first is prevention. So prevention is about addressing the root causes of pest issues with non-chemical approaches. So preventative practices keep the system healthier or eliminate conditions that favor pests, like ensuring plants are properly watered, ensuring soil pH and nutrient levels are correct, using different plant species, things like this. And ultimately, what you're trying to do is reduce the stressors that can cause pest populations to increase out of control. So this leg of the stool is all about the use of non-chemical strategies. So things like mechanical or physical disruption of the pest, like hand weeding, also fit here. The second principle is about understanding what pests are in your landscape and if pest pressure even warrants any type of intervention. So this means observing and tracking pest pressure regularly, monitoring. Observing also helps you see if those non-chemical prevention methods are working, and if you can continue to manage the pest with these low impact methods. So thinking about pest pressure in your IPM plan is key for reducing reliance on pesticides. It's useful to constantly evaluate and make choices about when and where a pest is enough of a problem to justify the use of a pesticide. And often IPM practitioners will set thresholds for pests below which action doesn't need to be taken. And then finally, in some cases, there may be pests that defy preventative management and move above those tolerable levels. While we certainly don't encourage the use of pesticides, if someone is going to apply a pesticide, it's important that they understand how to limit harm by reducing the risk of exposure and by using pesticides that are of lower toxicity. IPM is really built on these three principles. So like this three-legged stool in the image here, together these can kind of make a balanced framework that can reduce reliance on pesticides and also reduce impacts to pollinators and people. I also want to stress that we're not just talking about substituting good chemicals for bad chemicals. Sometimes people think that substituting a newer product hyped as being greener is what IPM is all about. And that's not the approach we recommend, at least not exclusively. So ecologically based IPM is what we just talked about with the additional goal of conserving habitats, species, the processes that sustain life, biodiversity, and by extension, us. The National Research Council convened a group to look at this in some detail and came up with several criteria, including safe to non-target and beneficial organisms, as well as park staff and visitors, sustainable economically, as well as durable over time. And I would add that although ecologically based IPM is most often spoken of in terms of agricultural sites, it's appropriate for any location or scale. And it's important to not believe that our little part doesn't matter. Everything we can do to protect habitat and decrease pesticide use makes a difference. So now let's zoom out and zoom in and talk a little bit about each of these three legs of the stool in a little bit more detail. So prevention is basically the skilled use of horticultural maintenance strategies to keep the landscapes healthy and in good condition. Or if you're indoors, because IPM can be used in a variety of landscapes, it's maintenance to keep buildings less susceptible to pests. So this can include a host of general pest management practices, many of which a lot of you are probably already doing. So for example, the principle of right plant, right place, choosing native, adapted, low maintenance plants is a primary prevention tool. Taking care of soil as well, for example, by using compost, mulch, slow release fertilizer if you're going to fertilize, avoiding compaction, things like erosion and soil disturbance. Those are all measures that are important. Sanitation is an important prevention strategy, and it's more than just emptying the trash containers. In a landscape context, it means making sure you dispose of weed seed heads and other propagules and diseased tissue in a way that won't lead to further invasion and spread. For turf, mowing high and frequently is a recommended practice for healthy turf that minimizes weed pressure. So when it comes to invasives and emerging pests, we do recommend consulting local experts for the best kind of specific prevention practices for your area and landscapes. Okay, let's move on to the second leg of the stool. So this is monitoring. So monitoring is about knowing which pests are in your system, what habitats they're occupying, and then tracking the level of pressure and determining whether that pressure is at the point that it might trigger an intervention, such as pesticide use. So this step requires that staff can identify weeds and insects, diseases, and also understand their life cycles and habitat needs so that you can kind of break that pest cycle. Or you can pull in experts who are able to do that identification. So monitoring can include a lot of items. It's sometimes about doing inspections to note the presence and abundance of pests themselves. So a couple of examples are shown here, including dragging for ticks in a grassy area, using sticky bands on a tree trunk to detect the invasive spotted lanternfly, and simply turning a leaf over to look for the presence of pests like whiteflies and aphids underneath. But monitoring is also about looking for what are called pest-conducive conditions. So this would include things like testing soil chemistry and biology on a sports field, or even just looking for standing water where mosquitoes can breed around buildings. Doing this step well, although it might seem like a lot of work, is really important to reducing pesticide reliance. Monitoring can actually save on costs and prevent unnecessary ecological damage by reducing pesticide inputs to the system. And keeping written records really can help you be systematic and kind of track those trends over time. And I do want to keep in mind that not every sign of damage on a plant is a sign of something concerning. So in this photo, you might see what appears to be damage, but in this case, it's not from a pest. Those circular holes are actually bit out of the leaf margins there by leafcutter bees, which are a type of native pollinator that uses small pieces of leaves to line its nests with. Okay, so moving on to the last principle and third leg of the stool, limiting pesticide harm. So ecological IPM programs reduce the potential for harm, not just to pollinators, but also to people, pets, and water resources. So usually the first concern we tend to think about with pesticides is how toxic is it? Limiting toxicity risk is one strategy to reduce the potential for harm. So this means avoiding chemicals that pose a high potential at labeled rates for mortality to bees, or of course, people or pets. Also important is limiting the use of chemicals that are known to pose longer term, what are called sublethal effects, such as reproductive harms, cancer, impacts to learning, things like that. Keep in mind that chemicals that are toxic to people aren't necessarily the same chemicals that are toxic to pollinators. So where do you figure out how toxic a chemical is to a particular group? And you can look at the label, which will provide some clues to short-term capacity of the pesticide to cause mortality or other health effects to specific groups of animals. But you won't find things like potential for the pesticide to cause developmental or reproductive or even cancer effects on the label. You need to look at more specialized information for that. Many cities and campuses have kind of cut through this complexity a little bit by requiring the use of organic pesticides exclusively. And organic pesticides are natural materials that usually show lower toxicity than synthetics to a wide array of organisms, but many of them still can be quite toxic. Specific to pollinators, linked on the webpage for the summit, there are some resources that we added that can help you assess the toxicity risk of different pesticides to pollinators. So I encourage you to look at those. So what are some concrete ways to limit pesticide harm? So I want to be clear, the overall best way to limit pesticide harm is to switch away from pesticides towards non-chemical methods whenever you can. When and where you think you will be using pesticides, build in ways to choose substances that are less toxic and apply in a way that reduces exposure to bees, people, pets, aquatics. So some tips that we recommend include no spray zones. So many cities have pesticide-free parks, which is great, and warning systems. So signs can be helpful, but also helpful are advanced notifications, including automated telephone calls or texts to people who sign up for alerts. But of course, pollinators can't be alerted in advance. So one way to avoid impacting pollinators is to avoid applications to flowering plants, to avoid soil applications where nesting may be occurring, and to avoid systemic pesticides. Stopping routine hidden pesticide use, such as combination fertilizer herbicide products, and then choosing lower toxicity products if pesticides are used, are two additional ways to limit the potential for harm. Whenever possible, if pesticides are chosen to be used, use lower toxicity products. You might think of insecticidal soaps or horticultural oils, and use targeted treatments. If you can find a product that's targeted towards the pest, don't use broad spectrum pesticides that kill all sorts of insects, and use the product at the lowest effective dose in as small of an area as possible. So let's illustrate the principles of this three-legged stool in action using a few examples. So we'll start with yellowjackets, a type of wasp. Most wasps aren't actually pests, and wasps tend not to be widely appreciated. They play important roles as predators of other insects, including pests. But of course, human yellowjacket conflicts do happen, in particular in public spaces. So to move past chemicals, it's important to start by knowing the life cycle and the biology of your pest. Again, so that you can break that pest cycle. So yellowjackets feed primarily on protein sources. Well, they gather that to feed their larvae. And then the adults will also readily feed on sugary foods. And the yellowjackets most problematic for people usually nest in the ground or in like little holes in the wall. So with that simple start, think through prevention. So prevention is all about minimizing, all about minimizing the conditions that favor the unwanted species and lead to a conflict. So an overflowing trash bin, like the one pictured here, is a magnet for yellowjackets. It's best to use tightly sealed and frequently emptied trash containers. And other prevention actions that could be taken include collapsing rodent burrows near areas people frequent prior to the nesting season, since yellowjackets tend to nest in abandoned burrows. And then you can remove any water sources near the area you want to protect and prevent water from pooling after rain. And then, of course, just teach safe behaviors, such as avoiding swatting and covering food and drinks when you're outside. So for the monitoring part of this, as a practitioner, you often need to be able to differentiate the problem species from the non-problem species. And in this case, examining the nests or the insects themselves is a really big help. You can usually safely leave alone species that nest under eaves, like paper wasps that build small open umbrella-shaped nests, like the ones pictured in the center of this slide. And paper wasps also have a thin waist and legs that kind of hang behind them when they fly. You'll also want to look for those conducive conditions. So access to food and nesting sites, like those trash bins, rodent burrows, or holes in the wall. For treatment, to suppress populations, pesticides are not the only tool. You can have nests removed, but this is a dangerous strategy that's best done by professionals and only early in the season. And trapping alone can be useful, especially for reducing the number of foragers. Research at Cornell University indicated that traps can reduce the number of yellowjackets by as much as 30%. But because traps can actually attract yellowjackets into the area, it's best to reserve traps for locations where things like discarded food, things that are attractive to yellowjackets, can't be managed. And if pesticides are used, only treat areas where people are in harm's way, and if the other methods haven't proven to be effective. Use a spot-specific aerosol or a dust treatment, and only a small amount is necessary. So for our second example, we have sports fields. And these can be hard places to manage since they're subjected to a lot of wear and tear, which promotes bare spots and weeds. But routinely using herbicides to maintain evenly growing grass does come with risks. So again, start with prevention. So cultural practices for dense, healthy turf and healthy soil include feeding the soil, mowing high, irrigation, aeration, and overseeding. For the monitoring part of this, taking tests of soil chemistry and biology can help you determine if the soil needs a pH or nutrient adjustment, or if you need to add something like compost to help build a healthier component of soil organisms. A basic principle of IPM is not treating with a pesticide until the pest exceeds the threshold density that you've determined. So for weeds in athletic fields, the appropriate thresholds before treatment might vary with the weed species and the location of the field. But also keep in mind that over time, attitudes have shifted on some turf plants that used to be seen as weeds. For example, clovers. Once they were seen as a negative component of turf, but now microclovers, little ones with a low growth habit, are seen as a desirable component of turf. Okay, so I want to drill a little bit deeper into some of these concepts with a little bit more of an in-depth case study example. So Bethpage State Golf Course in Farmingdale, New York, was the site of a 9-year study with Cornell University and New York State Parks and New York State IPM. They implemented kind of a holistic integrated pest management program targeting insect pests, weeds, and pathogens. And their goal was to find ways to manage golf course turf in a more environmentally friendly way and to decrease the chemical inputs, given the growing public concern over the use of pesticides and fertilizer on golf courses. But they noted at the same time that there was this concern, there's been an increased demand for really immaculate golf courses from golfers. And through this project, they developed environmentally compatible turf management programs that are much less reliant on chemical pesticides. And in fact, they reduced the pesticide environmental impact rating by 50 to 95%, while still achieving similar user satisfaction ratings when compared with conventionally managed golf course areas. So they kind of have the best of both worlds. So in the next few slides, I want to give an example of how they tackled an insect pest, a pathogen, and weeds, and then how this kind of relates to those IPM concepts we just talked about. And I want to note, this is just a snapshot of the entire program. The whole thing is much more multifaceted. So cutworms are a pest that the golf course dealt with. The moths lay their eggs on blades of grass, and larvae bore holes into the thatch and soil. They chew off the grass plants in the night and pull the plants into the hole for feeding. And it creates small, round, discolored spots in the turf. So to deal with cutworms, they monitored populations, so larvae using soil samples, and then pheromone traps to monitor for the presence of the adult moths. And then we talked about thresholds. They set thresholds of about 3 to 8 larvae per square yard. For prevention, they found that using Kentucky bluegrass was advantageous because the cutworms didn't seem to attack it, and prevention via maintaining healthy turf was crucial. For a mechanical solution, when populations got too high, they mowed in the mornings for 3 to 4 days in a row while cutworms were still moving through the grass. And then for sanitation, they collected grass clippings when eggs were present to dispose of offsite to try to break that cycle of the pest. For a pathogen, dollar spot is a pathogen that causes these spots of kind of pinkish white damage. And again, monitoring is important. They came up with a threshold of 1.8 patches per square yard. And they found cultural control methods that helped, including ensuring adequate nitrogen fertility, removing dew as early as possible from the turf in the morning, reducing soil compaction, and watering to avoid drought stress. For sanitation, again, they removed grass clippings offsite that had the pathogen on it. And they found a mechanical solution worked, rolling the turf 3 times a week. And then also biological controls. They found that using 2 bacteria can be used as a biocontrol to combat dollar spot. And then finally, weeds. So weeds are something we deal with in so many places. And for monitoring weeds, they recommend setting both aesthetic and also functional thresholds. So there are areas where weeds were less tolerable from an aesthetic point of view, say greens and fairways, while the rough or kind of woodland areas, a higher amount of weeds could be allowed. For the functional threshold, weeds are obviously not going to be allowed to be on places like putting greens since they interfere with the function of the turf. The ball can't roll smoothly on a weed-covered putting green. And they used a variety of prevention methods like selecting weed-free seed, overseeding thin turf with perennial ryegrass, and aerifying poorly drained soil. And for weed removal in those areas that had you really needed the turf to have a high function or had high aesthetic value. They recommended mechanical removal around those places like greens and tees, and then only use spot application of herbicides when necessary. For mechanical removal, this involved hand pulling, steam weeding, and also tilling in heavily infested areas. And they found that in medium or low aesthetic areas, herbicides weren't even necessary to use. So now that we talked through some of the background and examples, I just wanted to touch on briefly some of the outcomes of adopting ecologically based IPM approaches. So first, as we touched on already with this golf course example, IPM works. So there's a lot of studies showing that strong IPM can significantly reduce pest incidents, complaints, and pesticide use over time. So this first box, just reiterating with this Bethpage State golf course example, they reduced the pesticide environmental impact rating by 50 to 95%, and users found it just as nice to play on as other golf course areas. The National Park Service permanently reduced rat populations by filling rat holes with concrete, changing the design of garbage cans, and also increasing the frequency of garbage pickup. And then the US General Services Administration used IPM to reduce the number of cockroach complaints by more than 93%, while eliminating the use of spray insecticides and reducing solid insecticide use by 95%. So these are just quick examples of different types of landscapes with IPM being used successfully across all of them. I also want to note that IPM can be really successful even in large urban areas. For example, in San Francisco, from 2010 until now, their tracking reveals a 97% reduction in pounds of the highest hazard pesticides. And this reduction has occurred across landscape types. As you can see on this graph on the right-hand side of your screen at the top, this included golf courses, natural areas, and parks and facilities, but especially in their parks and facilities and golf courses. But to look at the big picture, they did report that lower hazard pesticides have risen as a replacement over that same time period. And you can look at this in different ways. So San Francisco's IPM manager says they don't have a pesticide reduction program, they have a harm reduction program. And I want to note that city and campus properties are important, but for those of you who work in residential spaces, you might wonder sometimes how to get households to reduce their pesticide impacts, because residential pesticide use does account for a big footprint in the US, and making progress here is really important. So a lot of the same principles of IPM do scale down and can be used in the home yard. And to engage more people in using these resources, the key is to inspire, educate, and to organize. A lot of residents aren't aware of the impact that pesticides and typical gardening practices can have on pollinators and other invertebrates. So this type of outreach is really important. Just have another slide here. So for those of you who are community members or who work for a municipality, there are a variety of different creative efforts that you can use from either the grassroots level or the municipal level to try and reach residents to educate them about pesticide reduction and alternative pest control. So some of these might include things like outreach at events, like field days, science walks, or simply tabling at things like farmers markets. You can tandem with existing events to increase your audience, like Earth Day events or parades. You can pitch stories to local news organizations, write articles in neighborhood newsletters, things like that. And you can also do municipal recognition. So you can have potentially awards, things like signage, awards for people who participate in pesticide reduction efforts. And then garden tours can be really effective because people can learn, but also get a sense of what their neighbors are doing and kind of facilitate peer-to-peer learning, which can be really powerful. Decatur, Georgia is one of Xerces Beast City affiliates and is a great example. They put together a fantastic grassroots educational campaign about the risks of mosquito spraying and even work on the local policy level. And it's a really great example of outreach within a community to really make a difference. And you can find more information on their site.
Excellent tips, Aaron. We've got quite a few questions here to get to if you want to.
Sounds good. And that was pretty much wrapping up there. So I just want to say we also have a lot of resources on the Xerces website that you can